Louis Armstrong was 3 notes into Hello Dolly when the lights went out. All of them. The massive ballroom of the Grand Hotel in Miami Beach plunged into complete darkness, and 800 of the wealthiest people in America began to murmur nervously. But this wasn't an accident. This wasn't a power failure. This was sabotage. And the man responsible was sitting in the front row, smiling in the darkness, waiting for Louis Armstrong to break. What happened in the next 20 minutes didn't just save the show. It exposed the ugliest secret in American entertainment and turned Louis Armstrong from a beloved entertainer into a revolutionary. All because of 5 words whispered in the dark: "Play for us, boy, play." To understand why those words were a declaration of war, you need to understand what January 15, 1961 meant for American music. This wasn't just another concert. This was supposed to be Louis Armstrong's coronation as the undisputed king of American entertainment. Every major record label executive, every television producer, every Hollywood mogul worth knowing had flown to Miami for this performance. The event was being filmed for a television special that would air during prime time on 3 networks simultaneously. Louis was set to make more money from this one night than most musicians made in their entire careers. It was his moment to transcend race, to become not just a black entertainer, but the American entertainer. But there were men in that room who would rather see the world burn than watch a black man wear that crown. The Grand Hotel in Miami Beach was the pinnacle of American luxury in 1961. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, gold leaf everywhere you looked. It was where presidents stayed, where movie stars honeymooned, where the most powerful people in the country came to see and be seen. And tonight, for the first time in its history, a black performer was headlining in the main ballroom. This hadn't happened without a fight. For months, the hotel's owner, Theodore Blackwood, had resisted. Blackwood was old money from Charleston, a man who believed that some traditions should never change. But television was changing everything. The sponsors wanted Louis Armstrong. The networks demanded Louis Armstrong. And the money was too big to ignore. So Blackwood had agreed, but with conditions. Humiliating, degrading conditions designed to remind everyone exactly where they stood in his world. Louis couldn't enter through the main lobby. He had to use the service entrance, walking past garbage cans and loading docks like hired help. He couldn't eat in the hotel restaurants. His dressing room was actually a converted storage closet in the basement, not the luxurious suite offered to white performers. And most insulting of all, he couldn't stay in the hotel overnight. After the performance, he would have to drive 40 miles to a colored boarding house in Overtown. Louis's manager, Joe Glazer, had begged him to refuse these terms. "You don't need this, Louis. You're bigger than this." But Louis had just smiled that famous smile and shook his head. "Sometimes you got to go through the swamp to get to the other side, Joe. This one night might open doors for a lot of other cats." What Louis didn't know was that Theodore Blackwood had no intention of letting any doors open. He had called in favors from powerful friends, men who shared his vision of how the world should work, men who believed that if you couldn't stop change, you could at least make it so ugly and humiliating that no one would try again. The plan was elegant in its cruelty. Let Louis Armstrong perform. Let him think he had won. And then, at the moment of his greatest triumph, destroy him so completely that no black performer would dare aim so high again. The sabotage began before Louis even reached the stage. Someone had tampered with his instruments. His primary trumpet had a valve that stuck. His backup horn had been slightly damaged, producing a buzzy, unprofessional sound. His sheet music had been stolen and replaced with fake charts in the wrong key. Even his lucky white handkerchief, the one he'd carried for 20 years, had vanished from his dressing room. But Louis Armstrong hadn't survived the mean streets of New Orleans by giving up when things got tough. He borrowed instruments from the house band. He played from memory. He performed with a crumpled napkin instead of his handkerchief. And when he walked onto that stage at 9:00 p.m. sharp, he was still smiling. The audience gave him a standing ovation before he played a single note. These were sophisticated people. They knew they were witnessing history. The first black performer to headline the Grand Hotel's main ballroom, being broadcast live to millions of Americans. Louis launched into his opening number, Mac the Knife, and for 10 glorious minutes it seemed like he was going to triumph over every obstacle. His borrowed trumpet sang like an angel. His gravelly voice filled the ballroom with warmth and joy. The audience was eating out of his hand. But Theodore Blackwood and his conspirators weren't finished. The lights cutting out wasn't random. It was timed to the exact moment when Louis would be at his most vulnerable, transitioning into the emotional heart of his set. The television cameras stopped rolling. The audience couldn't see the stage, and in that darkness, the psychological warfare began. "Play for us, boy, play." The voice came from somewhere in the front row. It was cultured, educated, dripping with the kind of casual contempt that money and power could breed. Other voices joined in. "Come on, boy, we paid good money. Dance for us, Sambo. Sing us a spiritual." Each taunt was designed to strip away Louis's dignity, to reduce him from an artist to a minstrel, from a man to a thing. In the darkness, with the cameras off and no witnesses who mattered, these men felt free to show their true faces. Most performers would have fled. Some might have fought back with angry words. A few might have simply stood there and taken it, waiting for the lights to come back on. Louis Armstrong did something different. He started to laugh, not a bitter laugh, not an angry laugh, the genuine, joyful, infectious laugh that had made him famous around the world. It started quietly, almost to himself, and then grew until it filled the silent ballroom. "You know what, cats?" Louis said, his voice carrying clearly in the darkness. "This reminds me of a story." He didn't shout. He didn't rage. He just started talking, his voice conversational, intimate, like he was chatting with old friends. "When I was about 7 years old back in New Orleans, there was this group of older boys who used to bother me. They'd follow me home from school, calling me names, throwing things, trying to make me cry. One day they cornered me in an alley, and their leader, this tough kid named Jimmy, he says to me, 'Play us a song, boy. Make us laugh.'" The taunting voices had stopped. The entire ballroom was listening, straining to hear Louis's words in the darkness. Now I didn't have an instrument with me that day, just my voice. So I started to sing. I sang the first song that came to mind, which happened to be "Amazing Grace." Beautiful song, powerful song. But these boys, they started laughing and mocking, making fun of how I sounded. Louis paused, and in that pause, you could hear 800 people holding their breath. So I stopped singing, and I asked Jimmy a question. I said, "Jimmy, can you sing?" And he says, "What's that got to do with anything?" And I said, "Well, if you're going to criticize my singing, I figured you must be a singer yourself. Otherwise, how would you know what good singing sounds like?" Someone in the audience chuckled. Then another person. The laughter began to spread. Jimmy says, "I don't need to be a singer to know you sound terrible." And I said, "Oh, I see. So you're telling me you know something is bad, but you don't know what good is. That must be a real sad way to live, Jimmy, knowing what you don't like, but never learning what you love." Louis's voice was getting stronger, more musical, weaving magic in the darkness. And you know what happened? Jimmy got quiet for a minute, really quiet. And then he said, "Sing it again." Not mean this time, curious, like he wanted to understand something. So I sang "Amazing Grace" again, but this time I sang it for him, really for him. And when I finished, there were tears in that tough boy's eyes. The ballroom was completely silent now, except for Louis's voice. Jimmy became my friend that day, best friend I had growing up. And you know why? Because I didn't sing at him, I sang for him. I didn't try to prove he was wrong, I tried to help him hear something beautiful. Louis moved on the dark stage, and you could hear his footsteps, slow and deliberate. So tonight, when I hear voices calling me boy, I remember Jimmy. I remember that sometimes people say ugly things because they're scared. Scared that something beautiful might change them. Scared that if they let themselves enjoy the music, they might have to admit the person making it is just as human as they are. Theodore Blackwood was sitting in the front row, his face burning with shame in the darkness. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. Louis was supposed to be humiliated, broken, fleeing in tears. Instead, he was turning their cruelty into compassion, their hatred into healing. "So I'm going to sing for you," Louis continued, "not at you, for you. Because that's what music is for. It's not about who's better than who. It's not about who belongs and who doesn't. It's about finding something we can all share, something that makes us remember we're all just people trying to get through this crazy world." And then, in the complete darkness, with no lights, no cameras, no microphone, Louis Armstrong began to sing "What a Wonderful World." His voice, unamplified and raw, filled every corner of that massive ballroom. It was the most beautiful, most heartbreaking, most hopeful sound anyone in that room had ever heard. He sang about trees of green and skies of blue, about the simple miracles that surrounded them every day if they just had eyes to see them. By the time he reached the chorus, other voices had joined in, quietly at first, tentatively, then with growing confidence. The audience was singing along in the darkness, their voices blending with Louis's, creating something larger than any one person could make alone. When the song ended, the silence was profound, not the silence of embarrassment or confusion, but the silence of revelation. 800 people sitting in the dark, suddenly understanding something they hadn't understood before. That's when the lights came back on. The sudden illumination revealed faces streaked with tears. Theodore Blackwood was crying openly. His hatred collapsed under the weight of beauty. The men who had shouted "boy" were staring at the stage with something approaching awe. And Louis Armstrong stood there, smiling that radiant smile, looking like he'd just shared a wonderful joke with 800 friends. "Thank you," he said simply. "Now, how about we make some music?" What followed was the greatest performance of Louis Armstrong's career. But it wasn't just entertainment anymore. It was testimony. It was proof that hatred could be transformed, that walls could be torn down, not with anger, but with love, that the most powerful force in the world wasn't violence or money or fear, but understanding. The television cameras rolled again, capturing every note, every smile, every moment of connection between Louis and his audience. When he finished his set with "When the Saints Go Marching In," the standing ovation lasted for 15 minutes. But the real transformation happened after the show. Theodore Blackwood came backstage, his eyes red from crying, his composure completely gone. He found Louis in that converted storage closet, packing up his borrowed instruments. "Mr. Armstrong," Blackwood said, his voice barely a whisper, "I need to apologize." Louis looked up, that gentle smile still on his face. "For what, Cat?" "For everything. The service entrance, the basement dressing room, the—" Blackwood couldn't finish. Louis stood up and extended his hand. "You know what, Mr. Blackwood? Tonight you heard the music. That's all that matters to me." Blackwood took his hand, shaking his head. "No, it's not enough. I want to make it right." "Then make it right for the next Cat, and the one after that. Music doesn't belong to any one color, Mr. Blackwood. It belongs to anyone willing to listen." That night, Theodore Blackwood wrote new policies for the Grand Hotel. No more segregated entrances, no more basement dressing rooms, no more rules based on race. It became one of the first luxury hotels in the South to fully integrate, not because of protests or boycotts, but because one man had used music to change hearts. The television special aired 3 weeks later and became one of the most watched programs in television history. But more than that, it changed how America saw itself. Viewers wrote thousands of letters, not just praising Louis' music, but describing how his words in the darkness had affected them, how his response to hatred had inspired them to look at their own prejudices. One of those letters came from a young minister in Atlanta named Martin Luther King, Jr. He wrote, "Mr. Armstrong, your performance showed us something profound about the power of nonviolent resistance. You proved that love truly is stronger than hate, that dignity cannot be taken away, only given away. Thank you for showing us a path forward." But perhaps the most moving response came from an unexpected source. A letter arrived at Louis's home in New York, written in shaky handwriting. "Dear Mr. Armstrong, my name is Jimmy Patterson. You probably don't remember me, but I was the boy in the alley in New Orleans 50 years ago. I heard about what happened at the Grand Hotel, and I wanted you to know that you've been teaching people how to turn hatred into love your whole life, not just that one night. Thank you for seeing the good in a mean little boy. You changed my life then, and you're still changing lives now. Your friend always, Jimmy." Louis kept that letter on his piano for the rest of his life. The night at the Grand Hotel became legend, but not the kind of legend Louis wanted. He never spoke about it publicly, never used it to promote himself or his message. When reporters asked him about facing hatred with love, he would just smile and say, "Music is love, Cat. Everything else is just noise." But those who were there that night, who witnessed the transformation of hatred into harmony in the darkness, they never forgot. They told their children and grandchildren about the night Louis Armstrong proved that the most revolutionary act isn't violence or anger, but understanding. Theodore Blackwood became one of Louis's closest friends and one of the civil rights movement's most unexpected allies. He used his wealth and influence to support integration efforts throughout the South, always saying, "I learned something important that night. The darkness isn't in the world, it's in us. And if Louis Armstrong could bring light to my darkness, maybe there's hope for anyone." The Grand Hotel still stands today, and in the ballroom where history was made, there's a plaque that reads, "In memory of the night when music conquered hatred and love triumphed over fear. January 15th, 1961. Louis Armstrong sang in the darkness, and the light has never gone out." But for Louis himself, that night wasn't about conquering anything. It was about connection. It was about remembering that every person, no matter how lost in hatred they might seem, has a Jimmy Patterson inside them, someone who can be reached, someone who can be changed, someone who just needs to hear the music. Years later, when a young journalist asked Louis what he considered his greatest performance, everyone expected him to mention one of his famous recordings or legendary concerts. Instead, Louis smiled that beautiful smile and said, "The greatest performance isn't when you make people applaud, son. It's when you make them think. It's when you take the worst thing someone can throw at you and turn it into something beautiful. That's when music becomes magic." And magic was exactly what happened that night in Miami Beach, when Louis Armstrong proved that the most powerful force in the universe isn't hatred or fear, but the simple act of singing for someone instead of at them. In the darkness, surrounded by enemies, Louis Armstrong had chosen love, and in doing so, he had lit a candle that would continue burning long after the last note faded away. Because that's what Louis Armstrong understood better than anyone. We all live in the darkness sometimes, but music, real music, honest music, music that comes from the heart, that's how we find our way back to the light. And on that magical night in 1961, 800 people discovered that it truly was a wonderful world, not in spite of its darkness, but because of the light that people like Louis Armstrong chose to shine in it.